Welcome to the Show Up Dad podcast, where we explore fatherhood and share insights to support dads in being present for their families. I'm your host, David Mendonca, and today we have a very special guest. But before we start, I want to thank our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by the Tall Man Equipment, your go-to source for quality tools and equipment in the powerline industry. Visit tallmanequipment.com to see the great offerings. I also want to give a shout out to the Show Up Dad Foundation. They're dedicated to helping fathers become more engaged in their family through workshops and community support. To learn more about their mission and to donate to this great cause, visit the showupdadfoundation.org. Well, guys, today's guest is Jason Schnitzer, a dedicated men's relationship coach committed to empowering men to master self-control and effectively manage their nervous systems for fulfilling marriage. With a proven track record of helping hundreds of men, Jason guides them in managing anger, mending their relationships, setting positive examples for their children, and discovering inner peace. Tune in to reignite your passion for life and become the best version of yourself. Welcome to our show, brother.
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, for sure, man. Well, I see you all over Instagram, Jason. You have such great insightful wisdom that I always post, and I was like, man, I got to get this guy on here, because a lot of us blue collar dads, right, fathers, we deal with this. We never had an example of how to regulate our emotions. Typically, we've been taught at an early age to don't cry, rub some dirt on it and stuff like that. And what happens, that becomes very, very toxic as we bottle that in. What we're seeing now throughout my industry that I work with, the line industry, is a lot of guys are committing suicide. They have no one to talk to, right? So mental health is a big issue. And that's why I wanted you to come on here and just kind of share some tips, some strategies, what we can do to regulate, right?
Yeah.
Well, tell us your story, man, please.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Quite the introduction. And that's awesome that your linemen work with a lot of linemen. That's not necessarily the safest job, but also like society couldn't function without you guys. So that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, a little bit about me. As you had already stated, I'm a men's relationship coach. And the reason and how I got into this line of work is because I think, much like you've already so well explained, is, we spend most of our lives, due to lots of different factors, some of them being because we never got shown by example, others because, generally speaking, society doesn't leave a lot of room or space to encourage or allow for men to feel many emotions besides, maybe anger. We get into these relationships, marriages, long term, and it's almost like we're expected to kind of know how to do these things when we're communicating, with our wife and with our spouse. And, traditionally, much like it sounds like a lot of your listeners are doing, it's like kind of like I thought my role was to just show up, provide physical protection and, have a good time, and then pretty much the rest would just fall in place, right? But after, several years into marriage, you kind of look around and it's like things aren't all rainbows and rose petals as everybody kind of painted the picture like they would if you just did the thing, right? Which is what you talked about. And so, searched high and low, right? The internet was available for me, thankfully. Went to lots of different practitioners, therapists, just tried to like heal my relationship. And really what I found was like, as much as I was looking outside of myself for all these different things to try to fix what kind of was, the train going down the tracks out of control, what I was really avoiding was like kind of like looking internally as to like what was going on for me and like how I felt internally. And I realized that there was this like huge war on the inside that I was fighting by myself and really nobody knew about. Because at least for me, it was like one of those things where, I'd seen so many times and so many, men that you like look up to, where it's kind of like you take that stoic approach and, just basically keep it in, and shoulder
Mm-hmm.
it yourself and not ask for help. And because that's just not what you do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Reaching out and asking for help was to me kind of like almost like this showing of weakness. So I kind of felt like I always just had to figure it out on my own. But, I think everybody kind of gets to their breaking point. And kind of to your point of like, unfortunately, what a lot of men find as like a really smart thing to do for themselves in the moment is to, sometimes take their own life, which is really unfortunate. And that really led me to finding this work. And, we talked about like the idea of regulating emotions and all that stuff. And really, what's at the root and the core of that is understanding your own biology, right? Like your own hardware, and more
Mm-hmm.
specifically, your nervous system. Because I see a lot in the space and like this, and I'm not knocking it because it is great to be able to like, hey, you feel a certain way and still show up, right? You don't
Yeah.
want to do it and you still are able to kind of override that sense of like, oh, I don't feel like it, but still do the thing, which is a great muscle to flex. But in the same breath, it's like being able to slow down and kind of make sense of and organize all of that. Like I said, for me was my own internal battle. And when I could like develop the tools and the understanding so that war could be over internally, then all of a sudden it's like I wasn't using so much energy to just like overcome and to push through. It was a more synchronized approach. And it was a more synchronized approach, like I said, internally for me. And I think at the root of that, again, is your nervous system.
Mm-hmm. No, I could totally see that. One of the things that I've learned, just from my wife and her chronic illness that she had contracted, um, was your limbic system
Mm,
and how that has such a huge play in how you respond and react, right? When
hmm
that's super triggered, you go into fight or flight, from
hmm
my understanding.
hmm
And now everything you do is irrational, right? And I see that even back to scripture, where scripture says that a double minded man is unstable in all his ways.
hmm
So when you're dysregulated like that in that limbic system, you're not making rational decisions at all,
Right.
and it's crazy. I felt that myself, and it usually comes to me as in a form of self-control.
Mm,
Like when I can't control stuff, whether it be because I grew up in a home that had, I grew up in a home that I felt was out of control or
hmm
whatever, right?
hmm
And I had no control. Then I started trying to create this control in my own environment, keeping everything
mm,
clean, yelling at the kids if
hmm
they jumped on the couch, just
Right.
trying to take control of my household. And when it's out of control like that, I just start freaking out, man. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense, David. And like, you bring up like great, basically science and biology with regards to the limbic system, because you're right. That's the system that activates when your nervous system basically perceives threat. And what I love to talk about before really getting into, tools and tactics and how you regulate is really understanding like just like what are the mechanisms of action going on in your system and in your body that cause you to maybe have that limbic system fire off. And you look at it through the lens of what's called polyvagal theory, which was
mhm.
authored by Dr. Stephen Porges in the 90s and is just now starting to kind of get more mainstream. And what he did was basically update the old understanding of the ANS, which is your autonomic nervous system, which is more or less your nervous system. For people that don't know, is kind of like the way you experience the world, right?
Mhm.
It's like that felt sense, like you said, like in the moment you feel like you need control, or you're upset, or you feel the need to do something. And what is really at the root of that is just it's there to protect you, right? It's there to keep you safe from threat. It's really wired because like we as a species are just like wired to survive. We're constantly looking around to detect threat. Whereas like maybe 1,000 years ago, that was more physical threats, right? And
Yeah.
maybe more today, it's a little more subtle in a lot of ways. And like there's relational threats. Sometimes, I'm sure you and your listeners can relate to this. It's like your wife uses a certain tone of voice or has a certain facial expression, and all of a sudden that might feel like a threat, right? Even though it's not a physical threat. And there's three main states that your body can be in. And a really simple way to look at this is if you look at like an upside down traffic light and you have green, yellow, and red instead of red, yellow, green, upside down, you have your ventral vagal complex, which is basically the system that gets activated when your system feels safe and you're connected with other people. And that's like when you get to experience all those ooey gooey feelings, like the ones that you want to feel day in and day out, right? You're around your kids, everybody seemingly is getting along, your wife's happy, and you're just like in this state of bliss. That yellow state, if you, let's say, drop down the stoplight, is that like when the limbic system activates, and it's kind of that traditional fight or flight response where your system's like, I see something, I feel something, I hear something, I think something that is threatening to me. So I need to activate this system. And that is a state of mobilization where there's a perceived threat. And I say perceived because, like I said before, sometimes it's just a tone of voice of your wife that might be threatening to you, right? She's not probably going to be able to beat you up. But in this case, it's a relational threat in a lot of ways. And your body's gearing up to fight, right? You tense, you brace, your heart rate increases. Sometimes your breathing gets more shallow because we are in a state of mobilization. And then the last state, if you ring down the ladder or down the stoplight one more to red, that's your dorsal vagal complex, which is responsible for shutdown and disconnection. That threat that you perceived, that maybe you felt like you had the resources for, is just too much. So then we fully shut down, right? And we immobilize, we dissociate, we repress, we get into a state of potential depression. And it's not to say that, green good, yellow and red bad. Generally speaking, like what I help men do is gain the flexibility to go up and down that stoplight, or some cases I refer to it as a ladder, because it's necessary, obviously, to mobilize at times because you need to go do work. You got to go provide for your family. Sometimes you got to stop a physical threat. And it's necessary to shut down sometimes because every day, we're forced to in a lot of ways because, hey, I haven't met anybody that can't not sleep, right? Eventually. But where a lot of times we get stuck is when you bring up like the idea of emotional regulation, sometimes certain emotions really short circuit our system and just take us out. And especially if we're hardworking and especially if we're blue collar and you're busting your ass on the lines, like a lot of your guys do, it's going to decrease your capacity to really stay in the pocket or hang in the tension when you work, 40, 60, 80 hours a week, and then you come home and your kids are jumping on furniture and screaming and your wife's seemingly not happy. All of a sudden, grabbing up onto green or going up the ladder to green might seem like an impossible feat. And a lot of guys are just stuck in bouncing up and down between yellow and red. And unfortunately, or fortunately, that doesn't mean that you're like chronically stressed. That doesn't mean you are anxious or you are angry, or a lot of times you kind of get stuck in these states and then you get labeled, right? And how I see that is, and how when you look at it through this lens, is your states kind of become your personality traits. And what's like really cool when you start to understand this is it kind of de-shames, your experience, because it's like sometimes when you get stuck for too long, again, if your state becomes your personality, it's like, well, then people could start calling you like, oh, he's always angry, right? Or he's always anxious, or he's always depressed, or you can insert really any label there. And what PVT or polyvagal theory basically shows us is like, no, you're actually not those things. You're just stuck in a nervous system state and need strategies to help you come out of that. And kind of to your point, one of the most important things to know, and you kind of already said it, and I'll say it in a different way, is like when you do go into yellow or your limbic system does activate, one of the things that happens for you is the smart part of your brain, right, your prefrontal cortex, shuts off.
Mm-hmm.
And what that does for you, if you don't know what your PFC all is, what I'll call it and refer to it as, does for you, it's your executive functioning, right? It's your ability to um, delay gratification. It's your ability to regulate your emotions. It's your ability to solve complex problems. It's also your ability to connect socially and romantically. Um, it's responsible for so much, creativity, imagination, joy, connection, all the things that we need to really lead our families are up in the front part of our brain. So if you're stuck in a chronic state of yellow and red, to your point, you are going to come off as irrational, right? You are going to come off as more reactive or reflexive because you're in that sort of like it's developmentally, like from like over the course of time, that
Mm-hmm.
hardware is just an older, some people call it like the reptilian part of your brain because it is older. It is younger in that our brain forms from basically the back to the front. Brain stem, limbic system, and then finally our prefrontal cortex comes online at the ripe age of 25. By the way, I'm not sure if you knew that. So
No, no.
technically, you could say that adolescence doesn't really end until you're 25. So for all
Mm.
you listeners out there, take your age minus 25, and that's really the amount of time that you've been a true adult.
Wow. Wow, that makes sense completely. I mean, I always say that age doesn't determine maturity at
Mm.
all.
Mm-hmm.
I run into a lot of people who, I mean, they could be in their 30s and 40s and they still act like a child,
Mm-hmm.
through their actions, and what they do in response to how they, you know, treat their families or whatever, you know what I mean? The actions that they make. So that makes perfect sense with this whole dysregulation, getting stuck, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've heard this before. One of the things my wife does now is she does DNRS,
Mm.
dynamic neuro retraining system.
Mm-hmm.
And she has to train her brain because her brain has got stuck in a rut. It's got
Mm-hmm.
stuck into that traumatic incident that happened where
Mm.
she got this chronic illness, which was Lyme disease, right?
Mm.
And she has to retrain her brain and go back and rethink back to a time where she was healthy, where she was strong before she was sick,
Mm.
to try to remap the grooves that have been placed in her head from that incident, being sick and stuff like that, chronically ill.
Mm.
So have you heard anything about that? Or
Yeah, there's so like I take an approach that is
mm-hmm.
maybe a little different, and there's usually things that are really smart about your system, right?
Mm-hmm.
And everybody kind of has a different opinion on this. But like for example, like Lyme, if it is Lyme or autoimmune disease in general, a lot of times it's like your body attacking itself,
Mm-hmm.
right? And um like our body does things really smartly to get our attention, and it usually attacks us at our weakest point in a lot of ways. And um the approach that I take is like similar to like what Dr. Bessel van der Kolk kind of talks about, and the body keeps the score.
Mm-hmm.
Like in this case, like it sounds like maybe your wife had a traumatic event, and your body is more likely to remember things implicitly versus explicitly. And basically
Mm-hmm.
that means it's hard to sometimes like go back and think of a time, when you felt a certain way, right? Or to remember yourself in a certain place, right? And to like be able to see it and like remember that. You ever had some like friend come up and be like, "Yeah, David, you remember that one time when we went and did this?" Or like when we were a kid and we went and did this, and you're like,
Mm-hmm.
no, I don't. And then they start talking a little bit more about the story, and then they get into it. Yeah, you were doing this, and like as you're kind of like in the story, you kind of like get into it but not just in your brain, but like it's that state that you're in that you get into, and all
Hmm.
of a sudden like you get these rushing memories back, right? And
Yeah.
you're like, oh yeah, right? That is kind of like your body implicitly remembering things, like because like you're kind of maybe putting yourself there, like how did that feel, right? Or
Hmm.
like you're like envisioning that for yourself, and you're allowing your body to kind of remember.
Hmm.
And a big reason for this is like going back to the nervous system and understanding like, the components of it. You have a nerve called the vagus nerve that's connected um, at the bottom of your skull to the 10th cranial nerve, and it basically wanders throughout your upper body all the way down into your gut, right? And that nerve is essentially your control panel, and it's responsible for communicating information from your brain to your body and your body to your brain.
Hmm.
Now, not a trick question, but if you divided your body from your neck up, just this region, or your neck all the way down, which would be bigger?
Yeah. Obviously, the bottom section.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like by a lot, right?
Hmm.
So, to no surprise, the pathway is skewed in that direction because it needs more space because it has more information traveling up, right?
Hmm.
To the tune of 80% bottom up and only 20% top down, right? So, our body actually stores lots of wisdom, right? That a lot of times can be really difficult to access, especially if we aren't really in tune with it in a lot of
Hmm.
ways, right? And if we've spent a lifetime and we have lots of good reasons to, in protection, not be able to, feel certain feelings or act certain ways, a lot of that based on like how we were raised and the environment we were raised, right? Our nervous system wires in a certain way to avoid like experiencing those things, because
Hmm.
if we, like when we're younger, before we have prefrontal, we don't have the hardware to basically experience certain emotional states.
Hmm.
And if we get stuck in those when we're younger, that can be like pretty overwhelming to our system. And some people could call that like you might have a bit of like a traumatic experience. You could call it an emotional injury or like a nervous system miswiring, to where
Hmm.
like later on in life you kind of like avoid these feelings, right? And like things pile up, and all of a sudden your body's like, hey, it's time to pay attention. Here's an autoimmune disease. Listen to
Mm,
me,
wow.
right?
Hmm.
And sometimes it's an autoimmune disease, and sometimes it's your body telling you that you need to pay attention to grief,
Yeah.
right? Or to sadness or to your anger. Um,
Hmm.
and, obviously, I don't make claims. I'm not a doctor, I'm a coach, but it is really interesting, especially when you look at, the modern mental health system with regards to, how, mental health is viewed through the lens of a diagnosis. A lot of times what they do is,
Hmm.
when I say they, doctors, psychiatrists, and therapists, etc., they diagnose you based off symptom clusters, right?
Hmm.
Oh, are you anxious? How long have you been anxious for? Right? Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. That you just have like chronic anxiety, right?
Yeah.
Or when you look at it through this lens, is it like, oh, what's your history? Oh, you've been in a state of high stress for the last 2 decades? Okay. You're stuck in chronic state of sympathetic and yellow? Yeah, no freaking duh. You're anxious all the time,
Yeah.
right? Maybe we just have to figure out what emotions you've been avoiding, because sometimes anxiety could be like, hey, I'm not able to be myself because when I was myself when I was younger, that wasn't acceptable to my caretakers, so I learned who I had to be instead. So you're
Mm.
living a life not aligned with who you really are. And it's like, yeah, who wouldn't be anxious about that? Who wouldn't be anxious, thinking about every move that they had to make to say the right thing or be the right way in order to get approval to, whoever it is around them. And you do
Hmm.
that long enough, and you build up sort of this house of cards to where like you're always trying to be this person to everybody else. And you have this like, that's why I believe so many people have this identity crisis,
Yes.
the midlife crisis, right? What is
Hmm.
that really? Is like we are finally breaking free from all these adaptive responses of choosing things that we think other people will like so they'll like us, as opposed to
Hmm.
being able to live a life more aligned with who we are. And not only do we do that in things like our job, but guess what? We get married, then we have kids, then we sign up for a mortgage, 401ks, all this stuff. And like I said, like that just builds and builds and builds until
Hmm.
eventually, it can all come crashing down. Um, I'm not quite sure how I got on that tangent, but
No, that's perfect, man. One of the things I've been seeing, Jason, is more women now in their 30s and 40s are leaving marriages. And it's the
Mm,
same thing you said. I'm not the same person. And it's
yeah,
it's
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
like a midlife crisis, right? And it's leaving their husbands devastated because their husbands
yeah,
are not perfect by any means.
right.
But they're trying to support their family. They're trying to get help. They're reaching out to guys like you, like guys
Hmm.
like me. And these women are just so stuck and set on the grass is greener on the other side.
Right.
I have to leave. I'm no longer that person that
Yeah,
you married,
yeah.
you know? And it's devastating to see what
It
it's
is.
causing the family.
It's so devastating. And the thing is that experience, and this is not something that very many people know or talk about, is
Hmm.
actually a very normal thing to experience. And I don't mean that in a way where it's like, hey, you should expect your wife to like leave you one day. But what I mean is like think about like through the lens of like all the things that we just talked about with
Hmm.
like the how old you are when your brain fully develops, right? How old like you make all of these decisions about your life, who you commit to, a lot of times without even understanding who you are, right? And
Hmm.
a lot of times, I mean, I don't know very many people that are just like super aligned with their purpose, like know exactly the direction that they're going and like what they're going to do to get there. And again, who they are, all by the age of like 18. And they're just firing on all cylinders, ready to go, right?
Hmm.
Yet, like, I mean, I see it and I hear it all the time. These kids going into college or like graduating high school, like, hey, what are you going to do? And it's like you are asking a human being whose brain isn't even fully formed and doesn't necessarily even have that capacity to think about like 20 years from now how life could possibly be,
Hmm.
like the biggest question of their life, right?
Right.
And a lot of us get into relationship around that age, right? I don't know what the average age for people getting married for 2024 is, to be honest with you, but I got to think it's right around the age of 25, maybe even 25 to 30, right?
Hmm.
So let's just say, for argument's sake, you like the average age is 30. I don't know if you can look that up real quick.
Yeah, I'll look that up real quick.
But your brain has only been fully formed for 5 years, right?
Hmm.
So all that aside, here's the part that nobody talks about. When you get into a relationship with somebody, what happens is you form this state called emotional symbiosis, which
Hmm.
basically in layman's terms is just like the honeymoon stage, right? And what happens in that stage is certain aspects of who you are basically collapse, right? And
Hmm.
what that could look like in a practical sense is like basically nothing bothers you about that person. They can do no wrong. It's like you could hate sushi and all of a sudden you don't not like it very like all that bad, right? You do
Yeah.
things that maybe you wouldn't normally do, etc. And that's like fun and exciting. And really in that stage is what's happening is like you get attracted to your unfinished business, right? And vice versa, by the way. And you get into this state, right?
Hmm.
Now, a natural part of that process is like one person usually pops out of that state, right? And it can sound like, hey, this isn't working for me, right? And it can
Yeah.
sound like, hey, I need a divorce, right? And that is not necessarily the end of the road. And that's what a lot of times it can feel very jarring because for one person, that might be like, oh shit, like I didn't, what do you mean? I'm happy, right? And the other person's like, this isn't working for me,
Hmm.
right? And what that person that said those words are actually doing is activating certain parts of themselves that they collapse, but they didn't even realize that they collapsed. right?
Yeah.
Because they're saying yes when they mean no, and you are too. And like they call that compromise, but is it really compromise? Because you're not doing it from a conscious place. Okay.
Mm.
So here's the thing. In that state, when you start, and guess what? Most of us, what do? We get married in this state, right?
Yeah.
We commit to life. And
Yeah.
then next thing you know, 2 to 5 to 10 years later, it's like, oh my God, who is this person? I don't even know them, right?
Mm.
Because in a
Yeah.
lot of ways, you don't. Because guess what? In a lot of ways, they don't even know who they are for all
Right.
the reasons why I talked about earlier, right? And so, like, the cool part about long term relationships is you get to what bubbles up to the surface are all the things usually that you don't really realize about yourself that you didn't even know before that you
Hmm.
couldn't have known without the commitment of the law. Like, hey, I'm not leaving you, you're not leaving me, let's figure this out. That means like I'm relying on you, you're relying on me. Well, how am I supposed to rely on you if I don't even know what I need and vice versa, right?
Hmm.
It's kind of like do you have an iPhone?
Yeah.
Do you ever read the terms and conditions when you go to update your iPhone? Be honest.
No, never.
Yeah, right? You're like,
I don't got time.
I love this thing. This thing is, I don't want to spend, another minute without you. Yeah, I'll go ahead and accept the terms and conditions without even reading them. Well, that's essentially what we do when we get married. We think we know, but we don't
Mm.
know, right? Until we
Yeah.
say yes, and then we're like, oh crap. And what happens is like things start bubbling up, and that can feel like and look like resentment towards the other person, right? And
Hmm.
it can sound like, and you can think like, man, this he should just know, or she should just know what I want and what I need.
Yeah.
And that should be talked about more as like clues to like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that I needed this so much.
Mm.
And then I need to explicitly communicate that to the other person, as opposed to just be like, hold on to it with resentment and why doesn't she do this more and why don't I do this more and why doesn't he do this more, et cetera,
Hmm.
right? Because if you don't know what you need, right? The first place
Hmm.
that I talk to men about, it's like, okay, what do you blame your partner for? Because that's the
Mm.
trailhead you start on, right? So
Yeah.
getting back to this idea of like breaking free of emotional symbiosis is, oh my gosh, I'm realizing all this stuff about myself that I didn't even know before. I want to figure this out, right? I can't do this anymore. That should be like, and I don't want to go anywhere. Let's figure this out together. Because
Yeah.
what's happening is like there's probably resentment and contempt and all of this stuff underneath that because you agreed to the terms and conditions for the update of
Yep.
like boyfriend and girlfriend to fiance and then husband and wife without really like nobody sits down and like lays that foundation of like the rules of engagement because like what
Hmm.
happens is like we progressively make our lives more complicated by choice, by the way, by
Yeah.
taking on more stressful jobs, having a kid, getting a pet, having another kid, and as you ascend that complication ladder, if you will, what happens is your system gets pressure tested. And if you don't have the proper like rules and regulations between your relationships set up, well, you're setting yourself up for failure. And here's the thing. Those women that are leaving or men that are leaving, if you don't reclaim the elements from your side of the street, right? Relationships are 50-50 in that like there's ownership. There's 100% ownership in 50% of the relationship. Obviously, there's give and take where it's more like 70-30, sometimes 80-20, depending on what chapter or stage of life you're in, right?
Yeah.
That's not what I mean. What I mean is, have you done the work on yourself to kind of reclaim why, let's just say, your nervous system responds a certain way in this relationship? Like a common one would be like sometimes um, a perceived criticism from a wife to a husband can be taken on as defensiveness,
Mm.
right? And that
Yeah.
might not even be about the issue at hand. What reclaiming that it looks like is like, oh man, I'm sensitive to criticism because there's a part of me that holds a story and a belief that I'm not good enough inherently because of
Mm.
how my system got wired when I was younger. So then I had to be somebody I was not. So now I'm not feeling very fulfilled and my cup's not very full and my foundation's not very strong, right? And so like when somebody like lobs an attack at me where like I'm not meeting a certain standard, especially in the most important relationship to me of my life, that can feel like a devastating attack because the
Mm-hmm.
foundation is not shored up. And that's no knock on the man because that wasn't his responsibility to form, right? It's your
Yeah.
parents' responsibility to be able to lay that solid foundation for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
That being said, as an adult now, right, it's our job to go back, and this is that reclaiming of the 50%, to be able to like shore up our foundation and realize where our weaknesses are, be able to like ask for and build support in our lives
Mm.
to reform that foundation. So like when we're in relationships, it's like no matter what woman you choose to get in a relationship with, guess what? She's not going to be happy all the time, and that should be okay. Like
Yeah.
she's allowed to have feelings and reactions and maybe even say things that she doesn't mean. And you can just like maintain a regulated state during that and
Mm-hmm.
then have like a healthy rupture and repair, right? So,
Yeah.
all that to be said is if you don't do that and you just leave, well, I don't know about you, but maybe you've seen this before, but have you ever seen somebody get out of a relationship with somebody and then right back into one with
Yep.
that same person, but in a different body?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you repeat the process, and guess what
Mm-hmm.
happens? All you do is you restart the clock on emotional symbiosis. Same stuff happens. You
Mm-hmm.
collapse. He's so great. She's so great until they're not so great.
Yeah.
And the same things that you loved about the person that you got into a relationship with, it's like all of a sudden, like you hate those things about them.
Man, that's so true, Jason. Unfortunately, I've seen that happen over and over again where I'll see people go into third and fourth marriages.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, same
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the definition of insanity is doing the same thing, expecting different results, right?
Right.
Um, you have to visit those places. And for whatever reason, and I know this personally, it's hard. It's hard to look down in those
Mm.
deep, dark places where you need to do the work. There's a scripture in the Bible that talks about in order to destroy the fruit, you have to destroy the root.
Mm.
Okay. If you don't like the fruit that's being produced in your life, you have to visit that place. I mean, if you
Yeah.
just chop down a tree at its base, it still has roots. It's still going to form. It's going to start having shoots that come out and it's
Right.
still going to grow, right, over time. Because typically it doesn't happen overnight. This is something
No.
that's, like you said, resentment, bitterness. It starts growing if it's unchecked. And
Mm-hmm.
in God's perfect plan, the way he created marriage, like you were talking about, he joined man and women together with these baggages, right? And we're like mirrors to each other.
Mm-hmm.
You reflect everything that's inside of her and she reflects everything that's inside of you.
Mm-hmm.
And tension rises because we don't like, for whatever reason, our brains are wired to notice stuff that we don't like, and it's typically because it's something we're doing and
Mm-hmm.
we're recognizing it and we don't like it in that other person.
Yeah.
But if we choose to understand that that's God's way of saying, man, I want to work this out of you, this is something that's hurting you and hindering you,
Mm-hmm.
I got good plans for you to give you a future and a hope. But in order to go through that, you have to work on this,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to work on it together in a marriage. That's exactly what marriage is designed for, to help each other.
Mm.
Like you said, 50-50, 100%, 100%. How can two walk together unless they be agreed? And
For
that's what
sure.
I'm seeing. You know what I mean? We got to come to that understanding that, hey, leaving isn't the way. That's not the way. And and I'm not saying you stay with your husband or your spouse if they're being abusive and there's no repentance and they continuously do the same thing over and over again, destroying
Right.
you with total disregard for your family or anything like that. No, run, get away from there, separate, do whatever you need to do, go to, get some marriage counseling, go to a pastor, whatever you need to do, make yourself and your family safe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But if there is repentance, if you truly are both working towards and you don't know what's going on, man, get some wisdom like you did,
Mm.
you know?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And because that is the kind of the narrative out there, and the thing that I'm seeing as well is just kind of like this like aversion to marriage, which like I understand in some cases, but like you're not gonna look at those depths and that darkness without some sort of commitment. Basically, like I said, it's like you're like the way that I see it sometimes is like we're in the room and we're locking the door and we both have a closet that's that's got stuff in there that like we didn't know about, right? And the other person didn't know about, and they didn't know about it because like a lot of times like we didn't even like bother to look in there to know about it, right? And what like marriage and long-term relationship or long-term commitment does is it, like you said, it forces you to look in the darkness. And the thing is, and of course, like you said, like if it's like totally toxic or abusive, run, right? Get the help that you need to get out of that stuff. And this is all only for people that are in, a healthy relationship, if you will. And but I truly believe that like most of us are doing things out of and for a very adaptive, smart reason. And a lot of times it doesn't look like that or sound like that in the moment. And what I mean by that is like getting defensive, right? And like maybe even raising your voice or yelling. Like that's not maybe something that like is aligned with the type of man you want to be right now. But if you look at it from more of like an adaptive approach, and like I had talked about like, hey, foundationally, if that foundation was laid really thin and, a criticism puts your system just like over the edge and into a state of, that limbic system firing, it's actually really adaptive to get defensive and to fight back and to
Yeah.
like try to explain why that's not the case. Because like what I always try to see it through the lens of, it's like, okay, it doesn't make sense now, let's just say, but when did it make good sense, right? And
Yeah.
why does it make good sense for that time period in your life? And again, going back to the idea of like mental health and everything and like looking into your past and how a lot of us just kind of like we look back in our past and we just kind of shake it off like, hey, like what's the big deal? Happened so long ago. But like I was talking about earlier, your body keeps the score, your body remembers things implicitly. And what I've noticed is, a lot of times we're looking back into the past and we're looking for these big things, right? And a lot of times we can have big things, right? Physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse that we experience. But in a lot of cases, like if there's not like maybe those glaring things, or maybe it's like, yeah, my dad spanked me, but not that much, right? We look at, and if we don't have those big things, it's like we try to make what were big things back then small things. And like what
Minimized.
that might look like is just like, hey, you know, my dad or my mom never showed up to any of my games, right? Or like I was really looking for connection and I really wanted to spend time with my parents, but they were too busy fighting, right? Or they didn't have time for me. Or every
Yeah.
time I was excited, somebody that I really cared about just like knocked me down a few pegs and didn't support me, right? And they're less subtle than, like ended up with bruises on your body, if you will. But in the moment, in that period of our life, they were big, right? But then we spend our lives basically convincing ourselves that they weren't big when they were, right? So when we look back now, it's like we've got this story and belief like, ah, that really wasn't that big of a deal. But at the same time, well, then why do I feel this way? Like, why do I feel alone? Or why do I feel not good enough? Or why is it that like anytime my wife even like looks at me the wrong way, I like go into this tailspin? And a lot of times it's the body remembering that felt sense of back then. And guess what? Yeah, it might not be a big deal now, but your body remembers, right? Implicitly. And you might be remembering the past and the present. A lot of people would call that a trigger or a reflex into a state. like we have these pathways, like you were talking about, like with your wife, these pathways that are kind of rutted out,
Hmm.
right? And we can create new responses, but that doesn't take away that old pathway. That
Hmm.
is our body remembering, like, oh no, not this again, anything but this, right? Because I'm going to be stuck in it,
Yeah.
and it's going to be like forever. Because if you think about it, if you remember back when you were a kid, remember when a year was like forever?
Yeah.
Like that's a
Forever.
year away, right?
Yeah.
And I can't believe my son's gonna be 2 next month, and
Wow.
um, it's just like it's 2025, right? We're already planning for 2026 maybe, and just like it just keeps getting faster. So
Hmm.
in the same way, your body remembers in a similar way. Like at the time when this was happening, it's like an hour as a 10-year-old, that's forever. Like you get put in timeout for 2 minutes. It's like the end of the world,
Yeah.
right? So it's going to be a similar response now, even though, we're 30, 40, 50, 60 years old. And that's like what can appear to be immature behavior, right? Or childish behavior or whatever it is. But
Hmm.
really, it's just a smart response that your body remembers, to where now there's tools, skills, and help that can get you to rewire that response. So we're operating from that front part of our brain instead of reflexing into like our limbic system and just reacting. And really, that can come off as irrational. And why it can be like so de-shaming to really understand this is like people like our wife, people around us, they start labeling us as like immature, childish. Why can't you grow up? Why can't you just be a man? All these things.
Hmm.
To which I respond like, hey, like that's not you, right? Because a lot of times men that are in these responses, like they're like, dude, that's not me. And they feel this like heavy weight of like, what's wrong with me? Like, why can't I do
Yes.
this thing? Like everybody else is doing it. It's just me. And like when you add on top of that the weight of like, oh my gosh, like my kids are watching, right? And what's this gonna mean for my marriage? And then like, man, if this doesn't work out, like then what? Like the shame of like, divorce, and what are everybody gonna say? So there's so many layers to this.
No, there definitely is. I like that you said the shame because shame played. It's so insidious. I've had
Mm,
a past guest on here, Dr. Stephen Poulter.
mm-hmm,
He does explicitly with shame and how it
mm-hmm.
affects men and women. And he talks about how shame will keep you from doing the right thing. It'll
Yeah,
keep you locked up. It's like bondage, right?
right.
And I definitely see that with a lot of people that are going through similar instances, right?
Mm-hmm,
Um, they are afraid to speak out. They are afraid to get it all out and say, "Hey, this is what I've been doing,"
mm-hmm.
right? And it just keeps you from. It's so freeing to be able to confess that, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, obviously you got to use discretion. You don't want to go spilling everything to everybody, right? There is bad
sure.
people out there, right?
Yeah.
So you have to have a level of trust when you do that. But one of the things I always deal with, and when I talk, because we look at it from a spiritual aspect,
Mm-hmm,
is man, you could always go to God. You confess when she shows you what you're doing, right? Once you get that realization that, hey, man, I'm really bad in this area. Instead of just saying, hey, man, what's wrong with me?
mm-hmm,
Confess to say, Lord, I'm struggling with this. I'm struggling with pornography. I'm struggling with these thoughts that are whatever. You know what I'm saying?
mm-hmm,
You confess it to him. You ask him for forgiveness. If you have hurt anybody with your actions, you go and ask for forgiveness from them. And then you ask God for help to change you.
mm-hmm.
Then and only then is what I've seen, and through my own personal experience and helping hundreds and hundreds of other men and through our ministries and stuff like that, that's when God can step in, because God will not do by miracle what he's called you to do by obedience.
Yeah.
And once you do that, he can step in. He can give you the strength to walk this through
Mm-hmm,
and to create the everlasting change that we need, right? Because we need strength. Because courage, I mean, my gosh, to just face yourself, you need
mm.
courage to do what you're calling men to do. Takes a lot of courage.
That's right.
It does. And we
Yeah,
need that courage.
that's absolutely right. And yeah, and going back to, and I love that because like take strength from any resource you can, and no better one than one that's like, never ending in its gift and its power. So
Hmm.
that's amazing. And a lot of times, like, again, going back to the idea of the benefits of, marriage and long-term relationship, is without the potential loss of the things that you've built. Sometimes, like, it doesn't matter how much courage we have. There's so many good reasons to not look in the closet that we don't. So sometimes it takes a bigger boogeyman to scare you
Mm.
to look at the other things and be like, well, that's not so bad. I'm gonna build the courage to open up that door, right?
Yeah.
And like another thing that I'll add that I think like a lot of people don't think about is, you know, those, Brennan, I always screw his last name up. It's like Kakowski, or he does a lot of research um with men and like shame and emotions and all that. And he
Hmm.
has a great line that he says, he's like, shame breeds secrecy and secrecy breeds more shame. Basically, it's
Hmm.
just like this dark spiral,
Yep.
right? And you're absolutely right. You want to like be have discretion to who you share with, because you don't want to share with somebody that's just going to like basically repeat your cycle and add to that shame, right?
Yes.
And for that, I'd say, like, whenever I'm dealing with men that has, like, because I view addictions a little differently than people. Let's just say a porn addiction, an alcohol addiction, or like, marijuana addiction, or whatever coping mechanism, right? We'll just call it. I
Yeah.
believe in different levels of coping. Like, we all have coping strategies, and unfortunately, some of us fall into ones that aren't as beneficial to us long term, especially things like, porn and, the harder drugs, if you will, because they're both damaging to our bodies in some cases, and a lot of times they're damaging to our relationships, right?
Hmm.
So what I ask is like, what's actually really smart about what you're doing? Right? Because so many times we can take the shame approach, like, oh, I'm doing this thing, what's wrong with me? Like, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, what's smart about porn? Right? Well, there's something going on internally that's overwhelming for your system that you're looking to something externally to regulate with, right? It's a regulation strategy, albeit maybe not one that's the most healthy for your long-term marriage, right?
Hmm.
But maybe instead of porn, you just need to learn how to regulate anxiety, right?
Yes.
Maybe instead of porn, you need to um, learn how to be able to reclaim the part of you that can't speak up for their needs and what they really want, right? So they seek it out in different ways, right? Maybe instead of porn, you have to learn how to hang in the tension of confrontation and the uncomfortable emotions that come with it, with asking for what you want and asking for what you need, right?
Yes.
But again, our nervous system is programmed to keep us safe. And if doing those things weren't a safe thing for us, like in our past, well, we're not going to do it. That doesn't take away the lived experience of how uncomfortable it is, that we
Hmm.
can't, say what we need, that we can't um, uh, regulate through anxiety, right? That
Hmm.
we can't um, build the capacity to be more courageous, right? Because a lot of times, like when we can do all those things, all of a sudden we start doing things in life that are more aligned with who we are, and we feel better,
Yeah.
right? When we ask for what we need and all of a sudden we get what we need, that's pretty awesome,
Yeah.
right? Especially
Absolutely.
when you're in a committed relationship where we're relying on a person to kind of like say, hey, I'm going to be interdependent on you to help me meet my needs, right? Whatever those
Yeah.
are. So when you can look at it through that lens, and of course, like when you share, all of a sudden, like you can drop that weight of that
Hmm.
shame. That in and of itself opens the doorway to allowing you to have more capacity to do things, because you're not having to carry around this weight of
Hmm.
shame, right? It's just this weight that you carry, right? And that's what I love about the like polyvagal theory and the nervous system, is like it explains why you're feeling the way that you're feeling in a way that makes sense. And guess what? Nothing wrong with you. You just got adaptive responses that you fell into, probably for a really smart reason, right? Because, like, let's be honest, like every guy that I've worked with, myself included, if you didn't have the coping strategies that you did at the time, how would it have actually been for you if you were
Mm,
just stuck with yourself without those things? I don't know about anybody else, but it was not a pretty thing to see or to feel.
no,
Yeah.
no, no, I agree with you 100%. Um, what I've seen too is like a lot of people think that a change of scenery, change of job, change of estate is going
Mm,
to change everything, right? But no
hmm.
matter where you go, there you are.
With you.
And yeah, exactly. And it's going to resurface again until
Right.
you deal with it.
That's right.
It's amazing the way God created our bodies, right?
Right.
These warning signals,
Mm-hmm.
even just through science and seeing, the polyvagal theory and all this stuff, the body keeps a score, all these things, they use this scientific approach. But if you really look at it, it's all based on God's word and what
Mm,
God's doing in his perfect design. These are warning signals. I tell a lot of the men I work with that, man, if your car, I try to break down things into its simplest form. Your car has
yeah.
a warning light that comes on. What do? You check it, right? You check
Yeah.
the oil, you check that. That's a warning for something later on going down the road that's gonna happen, right? I also look at it as in a sense from the spiritual aspect to where, you know, just like we give our children discipline when they're going the wrong way, they're doing something. If they're about to stick a key into a socket, what do? We discipline them, right? Not hitting them or yelling at them or anything like that, but we say, "Hey, son, can't do that. So here, let's go clean your room," or something. You change their
Mm-hmm.
focus, right? What they're about
Yeah.
to do.
Redirect.
You redirect it, right? When they don't want to adhere to that discipline, what do? The Bible says scourging comes, which is motivation for them to accept the discipline. And I think that's what happens with our bodies.
Mm,
We don't accept the discipline. We don't accept the warning lights. We don't want to do this or whatever because it's uncomfortable. Then pressure gets added.
sure.
And we don't like that pressure, but that pressure is there not to hurt us, but to motivate us into actually dealing with our crap, for
Mm,
lack of better words. You know what
yeah.
I'm saying?
Totally.
And we have to deal with it. If not, oh man, one of the greatest things I've heard is the battles we choose not to fight, our children are going to have to fight.
That's right.
You know?
100%. And I would add the baggage that everybody has. I think I posted this today that we don't unpack are going to be for our children to carry.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I love your analogy of the check engine light in the car because when you think about it, like for yourself or a relationship, right? Regardless of like what car you hop into with your wife, if like the check engine light goes on and for a really probably adaptive reason, you've learned to just ignore it, well, eventually, what's going to happen to the car, right? It's going to break down. Going
Mm-hmm.
back to the idea of like emotional symbiosis, that is like your opportunity to be like, huh, why am I just like pushing the check engine light reset button without actually doing anything under the hood
Mm-hmm.
inside, right? And
Yep.
guess what? You break up, you hop out of the car with that person, you get divorced, you get back in the car with another person, same thing. Like you're going to have the same type of problems, although it might look a little different because you got a new color, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
car or whatever it is, right? Like you said, you change your environment, you move out of state, you're still that person on that journey. And until you take the time to look in, to realize and understand why, just like understanding why you are the way that you are, can be
Mm-hmm.
such a powerful thing. And because then it's like you have your roadmap, right? You've got
Mm-hmm.
your control panel, you understand what's going on. And when you understand it, regardless of your past, right, it's your responsibility now to like, our parents are all they're doing the best they can with what they know. And
Yeah.
everybody has a different lived experiences of what that is, right? But at a certain point, it's like, okay, I need to go back and fill in this, manual that maybe only got a few pages filled in and understand that to the most depth that I can, to your
Mm-hmm.
point, or else guess what? Our kids are going to be the one responsible for filling it in, and the cycle repeats.
Man, well, Jason, this ends our broadcast, brother. I just want to give you a moment to be able to share with our audience how they can reach out to you, brother.
Yeah, thanks for letting me plug myself. I mostly hang out on Instagram at
Mhm.
Jason Schnitzer Coaching. So I post stuff on there pretty much twice a day, every day, and you can book a call if you're interested in learning more about working with me. There's a link in my bio there, or just shoot me a DM. Would love to
Mhm.
hear what your thoughts were on, our talk. Love the work that you're doing, David, and I just so appreciate the opportunity to come on here, share the word.
Absolutely, brother. Thank you for coming on here and just sharing your great wisdom. I know it's going to be tremendous value to our listeners. Jason, I'll have everything on our show notes for you listeners there. We're on Instagram at the Show Up Dad as well. And just to say, a lot of the posts that we put on our stories are coming from Jason. I value what he says. I mean, he has a lot of good insight, man. So give him a follow and like, and let us know what you think about this episode. Thank you.
Thanks.